This Week in Richmond is made possible in part by Dignity Memorial, caring for our communities with a network of funeral homes and cemeteries in Virginia and throughout North America. More information about Dignity Memorial's providers is online at dignitymemorial.com. The Virginia Chamber of Commerce, the voice of the Virginia business community, working in legislative, regulatory, and political arenas to promote the free enterprise system. Information at vachamber.com. Virginia hospitals and health systems provide jobs. They support our economy and promote public health. Local hospitals are always open to help people with unexpected health needs. Having a stable healthcare network is vital. Virginia hospitals are our lifeline.
I just received a letter from a student who thanked me for instilling the love of math in him. That's why I teach.
Brought to you by the Virginia Education Association, because a good education is good for everybody.
Additional support is provided by these sponsors. And by the members of Virginia's public television stations. Thank you.
Welcome to This Week in Richmond, and a welcome back to guests that we've had the privilege of having on before. Alana Austin, NBC Channel 29 out of Charlottesville, the only full-time television reporter here on political news in Capitol Square. Jeff can remember when there would have been many of them, and Jeff Schapiro, covering Capitol Square and elections for 30 years for the Richmond Times-Dispatch, and also found on TV and on radio here in the Richmond area, and thank you both for being on This Week in Richmond. It's been a short time since Cleveland and Philadelphia conventions. I'd like to do some, in a way, debriefing on what happened inside, since Jeff managed to be at both, and Alana was covering both on C-SPAN and back and forth on live streaming, so one of you was there and the other one was virtually there. And so let's have some conversation about the conventions and about maybe the impact of those conventions as it moves on forward toward November. Alana, why don't we just start with you, then Jeff hop in, and then we'll go.
Well, as you said, I was following through C-SPAN and the live feeds from NBC, and with technology nowadays, we don't quite get to be in the action as Jeff was, but I think it was really interesting overall for viewers, especially Virginia voters, to see Virginia front and center, literally at the Democratic convention, being right under the stage, seeing in the front row at many times Governor Terry McAuliffe, of course, Clinton's running mate, Virginia Senator Tim Kaine, and then on the GOP side, there was that initial kerfuffle over the rules, and seeing Ken Cuccinelli again in the spotlight, and then taking his his credentials off at one point from the floor. So I think Virginia remains a critical swing state, and of course with Kaine now as Clinton's running mate, I think we're going to be seeing a lot of him, and Trump and Mike Pence spending a lot of time in Virginia as well. It seems though they haven't given up on trying to win Virginia.
And how content Virginia once seemed to be to kind of stand apart from the nation. This was never really a terribly exciting place during presidential years. Consider that long Republican win streak from 1968 until 2004. Republicans didn't spend a lot of money to secure the state, and Democrats generally didn't show up. But politics is not static, and certainly population growth and demographic change are not static. And all of this aligned very quickly to make for a much more national state. And there are significant manifestations of that in this cycle, of course, most notably the Kaine election for the vice presidency. But that fight within the Republican convention over rules and process and procedures with an eye towards 2020 And very much at the center of it is Ken Cuccinelli, former Republican Attorney General, unsuccessful Republican candidate for governor in 2013, Ted Cruz's national delegate, hunter. So Virginia is most assuredly politically of the nation.
When you were there on the inside, what did you see or experience that even someone who was watching it without missing a minute, and others of us who watched maybe from 7 p.m. on, what are some of the differences that jump out from being physically in the arena?
Well, again, looking at this through somewhat provincial eyes, the standing or the changed standing of Ken Cuccinelli within Republican circles is fascinating. Very much the heartthrob of this conservative entity, but in this cycle, very much on the defensive. The first sign we saw of that was at the state Republican convention in Harrisonburg, when, of all people, Ken Cuccinelli was booed by the rank and file over using his mastery of the rules to put together a delegation to Cleveland that was dominated by Cruz voters, without regard, it seemed, to the fact that Donald Trump had won the Virginia primary. One of the things that I think a lot of people don't fully grasp is that in the nominating process on the Republican side, there are multiple contests that don't necessarily take place the same day. There's the primary, that's a measure of one's popular standing, but then there are these conventions in which the scut work is actually done. Delegates are selected, and we've seen this around the country, and certainly saw it in Virginia, that this was an arena in which the Trump people had some difficulty. Ken Cuccinelli was the chairman of the Virginia delegation. A lot of the ill will that was evident in Harrisonburg followed the delegates to Cleveland, and so we could experience that. We in the Virginia press who were riding along experienced that firsthand. A lot of that would not have been, evident to a broader audience.
And from watching it on the screens and following it on the computer, what about the Cuccinelli part? You mentioned something about throwing his credentials down.
Right. Well, I certainly don't have the insights or experience of Mr. Schapiro here, and it's not the same as being there. But as someone who works in television and understanding social media, these lengthy interactions on the convention floor, sometimes they get kind of boiled down to just a few seconds. So, of course, everyone who's in the hall has to think about what's going to be replayed on the highlights for the nightly news, what's going to be shared online. And one of the most, I would say, widely spread moments, at least from the beginning of the convention, was Ken Cuccinelli kind of taking off his credential, and it kind of, I guess, caused a scene. Breitbart News said, "R.I.P. to Cuccinelli's career." Maybe that's a bit of a hyperbole, so it remains to be seen where things go from here, but that's one perspective as a TV person. I had the chance to speak with Corey Stewart, who is perhaps a gubernatorial hopeful and was a member of the Virginia delegation. I spoke with him from Cleveland, and he said that Cuccinelli is not a never Trump person, but that he had issues with the way the rules, the process was handled, and that ultimately he's going to be supporting Trump, but he strongly favored Ted Cruz, and that there were perhaps some hard feelings still leading up to the convention.
And there was another moment the evening that Senator Cruz spoke and made his non-endorsement endorsement, if one can even call it that, of Trump. Senator Cruz's wife was on the floor near the Virginia delegation, and there were a number of anxious, if not angry, Trump people on the floor who, if one buys Mr. Cuccinelli's explanation, seemed somewhat menacing in their movements toward Mrs. Cruz, and so the former Attorney General hurried her off the floor.
Yeah, that did get picked up, whether it was in print from your report or whether it was on television that was happening.
Graham Mumma, who was also there for the Times-Dispatch, was actually on the floor at that moment,
Oh, wow.
and
Yeah.
had his iPhone rolling when this apparent confrontation was unfolding, and was apparently among the few, if not the only, reporters to actually capture that on video, and it was made available through the paper to a number of national news outfits.
It was pretty unbelievable to see how social media has kind of changed the game, because I saw Graham Mumma's video shared in international media outlets that, as you said, he was one of the only people who caught that particular moment of the night. So it's pretty wild to see how it's so immediate, and these things are spread so widely, so quickly.
I'd say it's downright viral.
Exactly.
Yes. Well, thinking about what challenges you had entering, both in Cleveland and in Philadelphia, what did you experience or even report on what was happening outside the arenas?
Well, Philadelphia, a larger, denser city, I don't think moving around was as easy. The excitement of the Kane nomination, I think, contributed to that. We had a national story unfolding within the delegation morning after morning after morning. And of course, Tim Kaine is, someone who lives and walks among us. We have a pretty good idea of who he is, and pretty much kind of cornered that story. But for a much wider audience, he is a bit of a question mark. And watching him move around and tell his story was an important part of the story as well. And I think anyone who has seen or heard Governor Kaine speak would probably conclude that his remarks to the Democratic National Convention were not among his, shall we say, most effective remarks, but nonetheless, a fairly positive introduction to this global audience. But it was also, I think, an opportunity to see how Kaine, for all of this kind of enduring notion of him as the nice guy, definitely has a capacity for driving in the shiv. He just knows to do it with a smile on his face. And vice presidential running mates, when they're not being lapdogs, are expected to be attack dogs, and he is fulfilling both roles.
I think you and perhaps some others who were there from covering the convention in Philadelphia who know Tim Kaine were called on by some of the other national media to explain him. I think that some of us caught you on one of the shows at 9 o'clock to 10 o'clock one evening on one of the cable shows, in which it was interesting that for those of us here in Virginia who have a certain picture of Tim Kaine, whether one is a Republican, a Democrat, or an independent, have a certain picture, the media was seeing him as a lot more, could I say, conservative or extremely to the right among Democrats. And
well, certainly among the Sanders people, there is this impression that initially,
yes,
that Kaine is far more conservative than he actually is, and I think those of us who have covered him on a continuing basis know him to be sort of innately liberal, but that he has dare one say, the good sense as a Virginia political figure to mask some of that, at least in the rhetoric, centrist rhetoric, and more, shall we say, sensible proposals. But as he's scaled the greasy pole of power, certainly he's moving into federal and national politics. I think he's had to be a lot more direct about who he is and where he hopes to go. The Sanders people didn't necessarily have a full picture of Kaine initially. I suspect that's now changed.
I think it's been interesting on that issue of the perception of Kaine that for Republicans initially going into this, many of them had said, well, we might not agree with his politics, but we like him as a person. He's somebody who is genial, known for being a Catholic, but very quickly we saw the narrative kind of changing, that now they are attacking him for gifts that he accepted while he was governor, and this perception of him as a Washington insider, and that it's two Washington insiders. So I think the Republicans are trying to get some of those Bernie people on board. It remains to be seen if that's going to be effective or not, but I think the Republicans are really painting Kaine out to be someone who is a flip-flopper, who's steadily moved from a moderate Democrat over to the left on issues like abortion and gun rights. So it'll be interesting to see if any of these talking points work, or is Kaine someone who is such a likable person in Virginia to Democrats and some Republicans as well. I don't know how effective it'll be. What do you think?
One early measure, and not necessarily a reliable one, that Tim Kaine, next door dad,
Right.
the image and the words
Right.
often used to describe him following the convention, has had at least a beneficial and advantageous effect for Democrats in Virginia. Last week, the Clinton-Kaine ticket started dialing back on its television advertising in Virginia. There are dollars that can be perhaps spent elsewhere. At the same time, the Trump people are starting to look at, we're told, at making some type of a modest buy. But I think it's safe to conclude that retreating somewhat in on the television advertising front is perhaps for Democrats an encouraging sign. So maybe, at least in one small way, Kaine has helped pin down his home state, which is among a half a dozen battleground states.
And at least one now supporter of Clinton I saw had claimed her naming Tim Kaine as one of the things that helped her make her final decision. Meg Whitman, who ran unsuccessfully for governor of California, at the end of some article about her decision, it was that her naming him as a centrist, as a moderate from that Republican perspective.
Kaine is basically an insider. He works within the system, and I would think that this is probably one of the points that commended him to Clinton, that he could be left of center on a number of issues, but he wasn't going to be pursuing those issues outside of the kind of the accepted political realm. And he's always been very conscious of process and procedures and protocol, for example, and the political implications that accompany that. Remember, this is the governor who, shortly before leaving office, graciously turned down an invitation from the ACLU to sign a blanket restoration rights order, similar to the one that Governor McAuliffe signed that's been blocked by the Supreme Court.
Yes, and before we get to that, back to that issue, which is still alive, and maybe other issues, anything else from either of you about the conventions or the aftermath of results of what happened or did not happen at either convention?
Oh, I think that both parties still have a little bit of an issue as far as uniting the entirety of the base. I think most Republicans are going to end up supporting Trump. I think most Democrats will end up supporting Clinton. But I think both of them still, the conventions highlighted that there's still unrest on both sides. The polls largely show that both candidates are either unlikable or not trusted. So I think that this is going to be an issue that both Clinton, Kaine, and Trump, Pence are going to have to figure out heading into November, really making sure that they stay on message, and that for Clinton it might be setting aside the emails issue, finally coming to some type of an explanation that is, you know, going to appease some folks who are unhappy. And then I think for Trump, a lot of Republicans, they want him to stay on message and focus on economy and security and Clinton's record, and not so much on some of these sidebar issues.
Back on March 1st, the Republican primary, it was clear that there is an enthusiasm problem on the Democratic side. The Clinton-Sanders primary drew, about 800,000 votes. The Republican primary, there were 9 or 10 candidates on the ballot, who were at least active candidates at the time, and over 1 million votes were cast. So there's a good deal of excitement on the Republican side that really hasn't emerged yet among Democrats, and perhaps Kaine's presence, at least within Virginia, will enhance that. But it's going to be a presidential year. Turnout is going to spike. The votes, the areas of the state in which votes are most abundant tend to be strongly Democratic. There's a lot working in the Democrats' favor, some of their continuing problems notwithstanding.
You mentioned restoration of rights. So let's go back to that, and then any other issues that are germinating and still being issues facing Virginia here, whether it's the economy or whatever it might be. But what about the restoration of rights?
Well, the court case was heard while we were in Cleveland, and I was pining to be at the Supreme Court that Tuesday morning, I think it was, or was it Wednesday, pardon me. And the case was decided very quickly.
Shocking,
leads one to believe that the justices have been talking about this even before the arguments and all the paperwork were submitted. The Republicans certainly can take great pride in winning the legal battle, but I think the political battle is one that has still been joined, because there, at least public opinion polls as a curiosity indicate that 2/3 of Virginia voters feel that if you've done your time, if you've paid your fines, if you've made your restitution, you should be able to participate fully in the civil discourse. And one of the things we never heard from Republicans, and still haven't heard from Republicans, is what would they do, or what do they feel they can do to somehow hasten the process, to bring people back in to this, if you will, civil conversation.
Well, the opinion that came out at the end of the day, though, as you said, there's the politics of it, and then there's the legality. But the justices on the Virginia Supreme Court ruled pretty strongly in the prevailing side that the way that McAuliffe went about it totally went beyond the bounds of the Virginia Constitution. But immediately after, essentially the way he carried this out was struck down, McAuliffe issued a release saying that he will be reviewing how he can be restoring the rights of these ex-felons. And I think one surprising thing, though, is that we haven't actually seen that happen yet. So it's kind of in a holding pattern. We have not seen any of those ex-felons' rights restored. 13,000 of them had actually registered to vote following that April executive order. So,
and beyond the ability, or now lack thereof, to exercise the franchise, these felons, believing their rights had been restored, a number of them, in all likelihood, signed these candidate petitions. What if there is a handful of petition signatures that are now in doubt, if not outright in dispute, because they are those of felons. Could that mean certain candidates won't be able to appear on the ballot?
And we will leave that lingering because time is out today. So thank you both.
Thank you.
This Week in Richmond is made possible in part by Dignity Memorial, caring for our communities with a network of funeral homes and cemeteries in Virginia and throughout North America. More information about Dignity Memorial's providers is online at dignitymemorial.com. The Virginia Chamber of Commerce, the voice of the Virginia business community. For jobs, the economy, and public health, Virginia Hospitals, our lifeline.
The Virginia Education Association, because a good education is good for everybody.
Additional support is provided by these sponsors. And by the members of Virginia's public television stations. Thank you.